as we know, the original Anglophone reception of works of love tended to read the two words in Danish for love as being strictly distinguished by Kierkegaard's usage. Furthermore, an earlier generation of commentators closely associated elskov with an erotic form of preferential, self-interested love, and Kierkegaard with an agapeic form of altruistic neighbor love. This allegedly firm distinction has been challenged by a new generation of scholars who have demonstrated that these types of love are not exclusive, but interrelated. Nevertheless, it is clear from the text that Kierkegaard does have high praise for the moral rigor of neighbor love, while the extent of his enthusiasm for or suspicion of preferential loves remains much debated even in today's conversations. Now, a common tactic in current scholarship on works of love is to come to the defense of preferential loves by imbuing them with some of the moral rigor of neighbor love. This paper accepts the recent, more nuanced reading of the relationship between the two types of love. Yet it demonstrates that Kierkegaard can also be read as allowing for the opposite dialectical movement between the two types of love. According to my reading of the text, features of preferential love are preserved in relations of neighbor love in spiritualized form. Specifically, the self-love that is presupposed by neighbor love survives in neighbor love itself as its ground. Because neighbor love contains within itself something of self-love, I will argue that that means it should be shown to all with something of the ease, spontaneity, and joy that is normally only shown to our preferred beloveds. Ultimately, what I hope to prove is that for Kierkegaard, we must love our neighbors with something of the attentiveness we lavish on our preferred beloveds. This paper then joins a new generation of commentators, including people like Carl Hughes, John Lippitt, John Davenport, and Michael Strasser, who have advanced readings of works of love that complicate the relationship between elskov and Kierkegaard and cast into doubt any overly tidy association of the former with eros and the latter with agape. The proposal I outline herein thus will, I trust, essentially complement an emerging consensus that we must read works of love as presenting an account of love in which these two categories are embroidered together in a rather more complicated way, rather than strictly delineated and opposed. Lippitt, for example, has argued for thinking of the role of God in loving relationships as a sort of filter that challenges special loves by testing their moral integrity. And in this way, he seeks to account for how neighbor love can vindicate romantic love. Similarly, Hughes concludes his book with the following aim, and I'm quoting now. He says, I will show that Kierkegaard believes that preferential love and neighbor love can coincide so long as neighbor love is what governs how we act within our preferential relationships. And finally, John Davenport uses the language of agapic infusion to describe how neighbor love is not only compatible with the special loves, but can also be expressed in and through the other loves, including even romantic love. Now, I won't be able to engage any of these interpretations with the degree of attention that they deserve today, but I will come back to Lippitt and Davenport. And I'll observe here at the outset that each of them takes it that the goal is to imbue the special preferential loves with some of the moral rigor of neighbor love. Today, I intend to argue that Kierkegaard is open to the opposite, but I think ultimately complementary dialectical movement. There are features of preferential loves that he seeks to preserve in relations of neighbor love. In fact, I would argue that it's possible that the nature of Kierkegaardian dialectic itself requires this bidirectional influence. Neighbor love is the morally rigorous, commanded form of love that so concerns Kierkegaard in this text, as we know, and commentators have convincingly shown how this morally obligatory form of love can infuse or filter romantic loves. Romantic loves thus remain what they are, while being charged, as it were, with moral rigor. Kierkegaard himself speaks often enough of this possibility when he writes, for example, things like that one should, quote, love the beloved faithfully and tenderly, but let love for the neighbor be the sanctifying element in your union's covenant with God. Love your friend honestly and devotedly, but let love for the neighbor be what you learn from each other in your friendship's confidential relationship with God. End of quote. So what I aim to show in the following remarks is that neighbor love, which obligates us toward all others, also preserves self-love inasmuch as neighbor love should be shown to others not out of compulsion, but with the free and joyful attention we give to our romantic partners and friends. To love others as ourselves then is and remains the obligation upon each of us. But because neighbor love is to be shown to others precisely as ourselves, for neighbor love to be genuine, it will not be a burdensome duty, but unstinting and cheerfully charitable. I begin showing how self-love is presupposed by neighbor love and serves as the ground of neighbor love's intensive focus on the whole self of the beloved. Neighbor love, that love that Christianity introduces into the world, at once relegates romantic love and friendship to a lower status, but in one and the same gesture shows us what these loves really are in the first place and redeems them by transforming them in its own image, a dialectical transformation that brings to light neighbor love's dependence upon and borrowing from the very loves it has excluded. Denying the stereotype that Christianity condemns preferential love out of prudery, Kierkegaard argues instead that, quote, Christianity has misgivings about romantic love and friendship simply because preferential love is passion, or passionate preference is another form of self-love. So what could that mean? Aren't romantic loves and friendships matters of relation to another person whom I love? Of course they are, but these relationships remain in the orbit of a self-love that has not been challenged or put to the test by the moral claims of the neighbor. For this reason, he writes, the beloved and the friend are called remarkably and profoundly, to be sure, the other self, the other I, since the neighbor is the other you, or quite precisely the third party of equality. Here, echoing a classical sentiment that the friend is a sort of other self, Kierkegaard also does not hesitate to label this sentiment a profound and remarkable one. So we should not then rush to judgment, it seems to me, against the form of love at stake here, but recognize Kierkegaard's esteem for preferential relationships, even given their association with self-love. Nevertheless, romantic loves and friendships, unless regenerate by neighbor love, remain a kind of what he calls spontaneous combustion. And I take it that what's implied by this image is that romantic loves and friendships are auto-generated. They do spring up between two persons, but they do so because of the appeal to each self that each participant in the relationship perceives in the other. In fact, Kierkegaard says most of the time, we're incapable of being left isolated and alone with our self-love. And that as a result, self-love really only flares up, as it were, when we are in relation with our other I. Therefore, he says the two can become one self in a selfish sense. Neighbor love demands that I love those to whom I am not attracted or whom I have not selected for special preferential care. Neighbor love, or, and this is an interesting point, Todd, that you made, which I've noticed as well, he sometimes says love of the spirit in a way that is not clear to me that he means exactly the same thing. So I think you're quite right about that. But neighbor love, or sometimes something that seems to possibly be love of the spirit, or perhaps not, and I'll come back to that in the Q&A, loves the entire person as such, not just those aspects of the other person that appeal to or remind me of my own self. This selectivity, I think, is the real target of the Christian critique as Kierkegaard presents it. Kierkegaard also, as we know, constantly contrasts in his works a religious interpretation of the phenomena he is examining with what he calls paganism, right? The admirable but limited outlook of the ancient Greeks, and in a different and debased way with modern Europe, the spiritless character of which he viewed as a kind of backsliding into paganism. His treatment of friendship also appeals to a contrast between a religious understanding and the understanding of paganism. Paganism, he argues, saw and celebrated romantic and friendly relationships because it did not occur to paganism to see them as self-loving in the way he has in mind, as sort of egotisms of two. I quote, paganism has never dreamed of this because paganism never had an inkling of self-denial's love for the neighbor whom one shall love. It divided love this way. Self-love is abhorrent because it is love of self, but romantic love and friendship, which are passionate preferential love, are love. But Christianity, which has made manifest what love is, divides otherwise. Self-love and passionate preferential love are essentially the same, but love for the neighbor, that is love. End of quote. So Christianity thus reveals what romantic loves and friendships actually are, for the first time. Paganism is unable to conceive of an obligatory love. For paganism, romantic love and friendship are a matter of good fortune, and that's a category that Kierkegaard associates with paganism quite a bit, fortune or fate. To find a close friend or a romantic partner is a stroke of good fortune. At most, then, he says, the task is to be properly grateful for one's good fortune, but the task can never be to be obliged to find the beloved or to find this friend. This is out of the question. Consequently, paganism can indeed see that certain actions would be censurable as self-love, namely actions that are love of the self in its exclusive isolation, and thus constitute a betrayal of romantic love or friendship, betrayals motivated by an egotistical discarding of the needs of one's friend or romantic partner. He writes that it is self-love when an unfaithful person wants to jilt the beloved, wants to leave the friend in the lurch, paganism also saw. So there is such a thing in the pagan mind as an egotistical failure to attain to what romantic love and friendship require of their participants. Nevertheless, Kierkegaard is insistent that there is no moral task in such relationships because they are fundamentally self-loving, even when their participants attain to the standards set by romantic love or friendship. What Christianity thus exposes is that even at their most noble, the pagan relation of romantic love or the pagan friendship is still a matter of self-love, and such relationships are noble. Does not paganism offer examples of romantic love and friendship so perfect that the poet looks back to them for instruction, he asks rhetorically. Indeed, the poet does. Yet here, as in so many other cases, Kierkegaard concurs with the church fathers that the virtues of paganism are glittering vices. So, I would like now to turn to another conceptually rich passage to shed further light on how these noble relationships can be understood to be self-love. And I hope, Todd, this is a partial answer to your question about other writings that might speak to these issues. Christianity shows paganism what romantic love and friendship really are, thus making a new distinction between self-love and love. For the pagan, self-love is anything that egotistically travesties the nature of the relationship and violates its norms. To their way of thinking, healthy and happy relationships of romance or friendship are not self-loving. Christianity distances itself from these relationships, viewing all of them as self-loving, no matter how successful they may be on their own terms. Now, Johannes Climacus, the pseudonymous author of Philosophical Fragments, provides in his writing an excellent and compact statement of one way we might think about taking this Kierkegaardian claim about self-love. And now I'm quoting from Philosophical Fragments, right? Climacus says, "It is the same with the paradox of romantic love. A person lives undisturbed in himself and then awakens the paradox of self-love as love for another, for one missed. Self-love is the ground or goes to the ground in all love, which is why any religion of love we might conceive would presuppose just as epigrammatically as truly one condition only and assume it as given, to love oneself in order to command loving the neighbor as oneself." So how might we understand this paradox? First, notice that Kierkegaard, in the voice of Climacus, argues that self-love is the ground or goes to the ground in all love. Any religion of love must therefore presuppose that one loves oneself. That one has love for oneself is the necessary premise of the commandment to love your neighbor, which, as we know, we are commanded to do as yourself. Self-love is thus the ground from which something else will emerge, neighbor love, in which self-love is nevertheless simultaneously dethroned and, I think, preserved in an altered sense. That self-love is presumed by neighbor love is constantly repeated throughout works of love, just as Climacus said any religion of love would have to do. Citing just one example, at the opening of section 2a, Kierkegaard writes, "When it is said you shall love your neighbor as yourself, this contains what is presupposed, that every person loves himself. Neighbor love presumes the presence of self-love in order to dethrone it, but not to banish it entirely. Neighbor love contains, he says, what is presupposed. Thus does self-love persist in some way even within neighbor love. Kierkegaard confirms this just a few pages later. He writes, the commandment said, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if the commandment is properly understood, it also says the opposite. You shall love yourself in the right way. So clearly, self-love stands at the basis of all love. Neighbor love intends to dethrone it from its place of primacy, but in doing so, neighbor love will manifest the truth of what self-love even is and preserve something of that truth in itself. Paganism, incidentally, according to Kierkegaard, abhorred self-love. Christianity, he says, does not abhor self-love. And I argued that what happens is it actually spiritualizes it, or transforms it in the direction of spirit. And this, I think, is what Climacus means by the paradox of love. So how does this paradox work? He says a person lives undisturbed in himself and then awakens the paradox of self-love as love for another, for one missing or missed. So let's consider a paradigmatically Kierkegaardian example, like marriage, to show how love for another can spiritualize and transform self-love while containing it within itself in this transformed fashion. Marriage is a kind of textbook case, I take it, of how a person might shift from the Kierkegaardian aesthetic sphere to the ethical sphere. In the romantic love that entices the lover to enter into the state of matrimony, self-love is the basis of that same love. How so? I submit we might think about this in the following way. My love for my wife is based in self-love, or has it for its ground self-love, inasmuch as at first, at least, I love her because she pleases me. She's attractive to me, the way she cooks satisfies my tastes, her sense of humor appeals to mine. Now, at this stage, I think it's premature to assume that there's something morally blameworthy going on in this realm of self-love. And I think it would be equally premature to assume that there's something morally blameworthy about the aesthetic sphere of life as Kierkegaard describes it. This sphere is the realm of preference, and some preferences do not rise to the level of moral evaluation. One critic of works of love points out at some stage that it's not selfish to prefer coffee to tea, and that's true, but I think that Kierkegaard knows this. And it might be too prejudicial to assume that the problem with self-love is that it is selfish in the egotistical sense that even the pagans recognize. Self-love is not always selfish, but it is always indexed to the self. I am the one that's doing the loving, and I am the one who prefers coffee to tea. So how does the paradox arise from this ground? I suggest that if I'm really to love my wife, there must come a time at which I love her for who she is. I must love her not only insofar as she appeals to me, I must love her even in those aspects of who she is that do not appear lovable to me. I must love her even when she does not appeal to me. So there comes a time at which self-love can no longer be the limit of my love. I must love her even when her qualities, her way of being in the world, her person exceeds the measure of my own self-love. The paradox arises when I discover that in loving my wife for who she is, whole and entire, not just those aspects of her in which I recognize myself, I do not cease to be a self-lover altogether, but rather I become transformed into a more lovable, more loving, and more love-worthy self. To fail to do this, to decide that I only want to live in accord with my own self-love, means that I refuse to love my wife for who she really is. And that results in me remaining a sort of cramped, petty, limited little self, pridefully clinging on to my own putative autonomy. To love another, though, means to let this self that I am become more expansive and capacious, not folded in on its own petty preferences, but enlarged by love for another. And this, I think, is the result implied by Climacus when he says, the lover is changed by this paradox of love so that he almost does not recognize himself anymore. When I love another, I do so with a focused attentiveness that is responsive to who the other person is in his or herself. In so doing, I don't cease to love myself altogether. I become a better self, more able to be loving and more worthy of being loved in turn. Self-love thus persists within neighbor love, but neighbor love precisely impels me to love myself in the right way by summoning me to love the other person in full. Romantic loves and friendships are in the end matters of self-love. Neighbor love sets a limit to self-love, but in transcending that limit by loving my neighbor for who he is, and as I love myself, I become a richer and fuller self. Now, if neighbor love retains self-love, I think that neighbor love itself can become a sort of romantic adventure in its own right. Neighbor love requires universal extension to all, but self-love provides something of the intensity of neighbor love. And so I want to argue that neighbor love shows itself to be a kind of synthesis. Neighbor love and preferential loves do not just sit alongside one another, but are transformed together by their coming together. Kierkegaard, I think, suggests this when he writes, if someone thinks that the difference between paganism and Christianity is that in Christianity, the beloved and the friend are loved faithfully and tenderly in a quite different way than in paganism, this is a misunderstanding. A genuine synthesis entails a two-way infusion or filter. Neighbor love can impart its moral rigor, its obligatory status to romantic loves, while keeping our relationships with friends and lovers distinctive. But the reverse will be true too, however. Love for our neighbors can take on the free, joyful, and spontaneous flavor of romantic love without actually adopting our neighbors as family. Kierkegaard is clear that we do not have to relinquish the distinctiveness of romantic loves and friendships in order to properly love our neighbors. He says, if in order to love the neighbor, you would have to begin by giving up loving those for whom you have preference, the word neighbor would be the greatest deception ever contrived. So Christianity does not call us to sideline the especially beloved, thereby precisely treating them as anything but the neighbor. This conclusion, I think feared by some early critical commentators, is intolerable and must be avoided if possible. Now, I'm not going to recapitulate Lippitt and Davenport's positions here because we've seen them ably described already, but we know, like for Lippitt, there's a kind of moral test that Todd described for us that can apply to our preferential loves in such a way as to sort of purify them of their potentially objectionable elements. Davenport speaks the same way about sort of a kind of infusion as opposed to a filter, but they're both attempts to sort of rebut this charge of self-love as being a problematic basis for preferential love. And I think they've done a convincing job, and I don't want to necessarily, criticize them in every respect today. Ferrara could also be added to this list. But one thing I do want to question is that while we might concede that preferential loves can be sort of morally purified by neighbor love, does that end up leaving us with an ideal of someone whose familial and domestic relationships have been sort of dutifully corrected by conscientious neighbor love? And does this ideal come a little dangerously close to the complacent bourgeois sentimentalism, moralism of Judge William, about whom we've already heard some reservations today? Is someone like Judge William to be the final word on love? And if so, then where is the transgressive passion of the lover fired by heroic faith? Where is the radical love that drives the saints and the reformers? Where is the love that Kierkegaard says will earn the world's derision and condemnation? I want to suggest the following. Christianity, Kierkegaard writes, recognizes only one kind of love, the Spirit's love. And I may come back to this in Q&A a little bit more richly now that we've heard what Todd has to say about this subject. The Spirit's love, though, is also self-loving. And I want to suggest that the consummate spiritual love, and maybe this is neighbor love in its highest form, or maybe it's something higher yet, but the consummate love of the Spirit combines the intensity of exclusivity with the extensivity of inclusivity. The trick is not just to love family and friends with the moral rigor characteristic of neighbor love, but to love the neighbor with the attentiveness and responsiveness that is normally reserved for family and friends. This, I think, is key to properly understanding what Kierkegaard has in mind when he says that a quality of neighbor love is only realized in love's humbly turning outward, embracing everyone, and yet loving each one individually, but no one exceptionally. Everyone is to be loved individually in response to who they are in full, but no one is to be loved exceptionally. That is to say that the intensity characteristic of preferential love is to be extended to all with the indiscriminate embrace of neighbor love. So we can trace this out again by way of the dynamic of self-love and love. Self-love is the ground of all love, but only in neighbor love, however, do I truly love myself, because only in neighbor love do I love all as I am meant to do, unreservedly and without exception. Since my romantic love and friendly loves are forms of self-love, something of their character will be preserved even in the love that overthrows them. Neighbor love entails not just purifying my preferential loves, it demands that something of the quality of my special loves infuse or filter my practice of neighbor love. On this more synthetic view, I should love the stranger on the street with something of the quality that I have for my child. And this is why I think Kierkegaard can write things like that love for the neighbor makes a person blind in the deepest and noblest and most blessed sense of the word, so that he blindly loves every human being as the lover loves the beloved. Now, we have seen how in the critical literature good answers have been given as to how the special beloved can be loved as a neighbor. But here I think Kierkegaard is saying this is not quite enough, that we must in some sense love our neighbor as we love our special beloveds. And I'd like to consider Kierkegaard's discussion of the command of Christ recorded in Luke chapter 14, right? In verses 12 and 13, Jesus says, when you give a dinner or supper, do not invite your friends or your companions or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. Now, Kierkegaard notes that at first Jesus refers only to a dinner or supper in connection with friends and wealthy neighbors, preferential loves. And then he uses the term banquet in connection with the poor, neighbor love. In response to this famous command, and with attention to these two components, Kierkegaard then poses this question. Do you not think it is as if Christ wanted to suggest that inviting the poor and the crippled is not only what we should do, but is also something far more festive than eating dinner or supper with friends and relatives and rich neighbors, something one would not call a banquet, because inviting the poor, that is giving a banquet. The point is that neighbor love is truly shown to the neighbor, not merely by doing your duty, but only when it is lavish and unstinting. So scrupulous is Christian equality, he writes, and its use of language, that it requires not only that you shall feed the poor, it requires that you shall call it a banquet. Neighbor love, or perhaps love of the Spirit, is not satisfied by adequacy to the moral demand. It summons us to extravagance, to profligacy, to wild hospitality. The quality of preferential loves that makes them easily assimilated to self-love is here extended to the poor, the despised, the neglected neighbors. We like giving banquets for our friends and family. We don't mind being generous with them and serving them the finest food and wine. We enjoy their company. What I'm suggesting is implied by this passage is that neighbor love should be the same in this respect. It should come to us as naturally and spontaneously as preferential loves do, uncoerced, free, something we readily show without prompting or without having to muster up a sense of forced obligation done with gritted teeth. Early in the book, Kierkegaard writes that Christianity has thrust romantic love and friendship from the throne, the love of drive and inclination, preference, and then put the love of the Spirit in its stead, love for the neighbor, which in earnestness and truth is more tender in heart than romantic love in union, and more faithful in sincerity than the most celebrated friendship in unity. So what impact does the love of the Spirit have on love? It has displaced romantic love and friendship, demoting them from the position of highest honor. Romantic loves and friendships have thus been replaced by something else, love for the neighbor. Yet vitally, neighbor love is more tender in heart than romantic love, and more faithful in sincerity than the most celebrated friendship. So despite these forms of love being displaced, neighbor love, in fact, evidences their most laudatory qualities in itself, and to a higher degree than they are able to do in themselves. The most tender inwardness and faithful sincerity are not to be found in romantic loves and friendships, but in neighbor love. And if neighbor love is truly to be more tender than romantic love and more faithful than friendship, then it must be lived out with the qualities that make romantic love and friendship so rewarding. As Kierkegaard himself says, romantic love is undeniably life's most beautiful happiness, and friendship the greatest temporal good. Surely no less, though, must be true of neighbor love as well. Thanks very much.